Hello, I'd like to share some information with you today in regards to avoidance coping and how we can create additional stressors. So this information is coming from Very Well Mind, written by Elizabeth Scott and medically reviewed by Carly Snyder. So procrastination, passive aggressiveness, and ruminations or examples of unhealthy coping mechanisms that we may consciously and or subconsciously use to avoid tackling a tough issue or facing thoughts and feelings that are uncomfortable. These behaviors are forms of avoidance coping. So here's a little bit more information about what that means exactly and how you can learn to cope more effectively. This is a two-part video. What is avoidance coping? Avoidance coping involves trying to avoid stress rather than dealing with them. Avoiding stress may mean and seem like a great way to become less stressed, and though that may not necessarily be the case. Often than not, confronting a problem and or issue, dealing with the stressor, is the way to effectively reduce that stress that's being caused. So we strive for stress management rather than stress avoidance because we cannot always avoid stress. And though we can learn how to manage it and effectively cope with some coping techniques and skills. So, what are some effective ways to manage stress? Active coping. So there are two main types of active coping: active behavioral coping, which addresses the problem directly, and active cognitive coping, which involves changing how you think about the stressor. So when do people use avoidance coping? People find themselves using avoidance coping instead of facing stress head on for many reasons. Individuals that may suffer from anxiety can be susceptible to avoidance coping because it initially appears that the issue, the concern, the stressor kind of goes away. And if you avoid it, you're avoiding the anxiety provoking thoughts and situation. So people who are prone to anxiety and or diagnosed with anxiety may have learned avoidance techniques early on, therefore may have found it more difficult to learn proactive strategy or strategies. If you learned to kind of adopt and adapt to these behaviors when you're kind of experiencing stressful situations, moments that may carry through and become more of a habit by the time you reach to adulthood. However, that doesn't mean that that's the way that things need or can remain. So why avoidance coping can be unhealthy? Procrastination is an example of this. So if something that we need to do that may be stressing us out, we may avoid it or even try to stop thinking about it. However, we typically do not stop thinking about whatever it is that needs to be done. Rather, we continue to feel stressed out about it until it gets done. So ultimately, we don't feel less stress than we would have if we just tackled the task right away instead of putting it on. The stress only piles up and on, ultimately leaving you to feel unable to perform the task or job well because it has not left ourselves in enough time. So while some people work well under like a looming deadline, generally it may not be the most stress-free way to tackle something. So why avoidance behaviors magnify stress? So avoidance approaches can create more anxiety depending. Avoidance behaviors do not solve the problem or can be less effective than being proactive in strategies being utilized that could potentially minimize the stress in the future. Avoidance can be frustrating. Habitually using avoidance strategies can create conflict. Also may allow problems to fester and to continue to grow. So again, this is two parts. I wanted to kind of like go through what avoidance coping is, and then we can go into the second part, which is speaking about coping strategies and skills. I do encourage you to seek out a mental health provider if you're finding yourself struggling with avoidance coping, struggling with rumination, also with anxiety or anxious moments. Please, please, please seek the assistance, the support of a mental health provider. I hope you enjoy the remainder of your day, and I hope this was informative.